All right. When we talk about dividends, here, the way I would kind of compare and contrast this is based on the journal entries that you will have. There are 4 major dates that you'll deal with. And I say deal with, not necessarily have a journal entry, okay? The date of declaration. On the date of declaration, that simply says our company is going to declare a dividend. At the point in time we declare a dividend, then we have created a liability, okay? So on the date of declaration, 2 things are going to happen. We declare a liability, which is some type of payable, we'll credit, and we'll always, or almost always, reduce retained earnings. I say almost always because every time we won't reduce retained earnings, okay? But at the very least, on the date of declaration, we will actually prepare a liability and we will reduce retained earnings if applicable, in most cases, okay? Then you have the date of record. That's the next one that's really, a lot of times, really big. That means that we're going to declare dividends for people who own stock as of October the 12th, okay? So if you don't own stock on October the 12th, then you can't get a dividend. Sound fair? And think about it, because once we have our initial public stock offering, let's say it's this side of class, and we issue stock to you all. You know, if you have a 30% goal in mind, you may make your 30% and then sell it to the next people over there. Then they'll sell it and sell it. So the data record also helps us to figure out who do we need to pay dividends to, you or to the 50 people that have kind of exchanged hands. So on that date, on the date of record, there's never a journal entry. No journal entry. So no matter what they put there, the date of record, there's no journal entry. The purpose of it is to make sure that you and I know who owns our stock so that we can know who to actually pay the dividend to. All right. Now, on the payment date. On the payment date, you simply reverse the liability and you issue whatever it is you're going to issue. If it's cash, you issue cash. If it's stock, you actually issue the stock. Okay, so that's the 3 major dates. And the way I would compare and contrast each of those is to actually do that. That problem, the exercise, I think it was exercise 23.1. That's a really good one to kind of help you with that. And also P, problem 5.1. Both of those will really help you to kind of see the difference between those 2. So if you want to look at those before you come to class next time, that would be, if you get stuck or the ones I think it was brief exercise. Well, there's problems, would you say problem 9 and 10 in your book there? Yeah, problem 9 and 10 in your brief exercises, okay? So make sure you look at those. Now, let's kind of go through these little by little. Typical dividends, as they say, is cash. That's at the beginning of part C. But then we go to liquidating dividend. What constitutes a liquidating dividend? Pretty much a dividend that is in excess of the balance and retained earnings. That is a liquidating dividend. Any dividend that is not a distribution of earnings. So when we think about retained earnings, we think about all the net income that we have not spent out. That makes sense? We have our income statement. After our income statement, we transfer it to retained earnings. That's just any income we made in our business. We have to pay dividends. Well, we can only pay dividends if we have retained earnings, right? So if there are no retained earnings, we can't pay dividends. Or if we decide to pay dividends without using retained earnings, that would be a liquidating dividend because it does not involve the distribution of retained earnings. That's simply all a liquidating dividend is. Okay. Now, what is a restriction on retained earnings? The way I would attack that is to understand what is the intent of that. The intent of a restriction on retained earnings is to communicate to stockholders, and you would to communicate something to stockholders what you intend to do with it, and that's simply going to have a note to the financial statements. So there's no journal entry for restriction in retained earnings. No journal entry for restriction in retained earnings. Okay. Now we come to the actual journal entries. Cash dividends. The best way to attack this is to just pretty much look at the example that we have here. On June the 1st, the board of directors declared a cash dividends of $2 per share on its $100 million. What are the 2 things that must happen on the date of declaration? Because what you're doing is you're thinking not problem now, but you're thinking, I hate to say you think multiple choice. Now, what am I looking for? So the 2 things that must happen on the date of declaration is I must do what?
Create a liability.
Create a liability and remove that amount from retained earnings. That has to happen. That's what you have in your journal entry. You're reducing retained earnings and you're crediting dividends payable. That's one of the things I did not like about the. Y'all see these people walking by here in their mirrors? It's raining outside. You can't look so good, right? You see some stuff up here, so. I lost my train of thought. Yeah, thank you. I'm trying to get back.
We were talking about the initial liability.
The initial liability, yeah. If you remember in your principles class, there was a weird account that you debited. I hated that because it wasn't weird. I think it was in your Wiley textbook. That's not what we did. It maybe gave you the false perception. I think it was cash dividends declared as what you debited. Well, the true effect is that you always, when you have a cash dividends, you're removing the amount for retained earnings. That is the proper amount. So if you refer back to your principles book and you use Wiley, that would be wrong in the concept of good accounting. What that should show you is that retained earnings should be debited, okay? Now, for the ex-dividend date, that's simply saying you should have purchased a date, you should have purchased the stock before that date, and the date of record means that you own it on that date, by that date, okay? No journal entry for either one. But for the cash payment date, that's when you actually pay the dividend, reverse the liability, and put out the cash. How do we get the amount? We simply take the amount of shares that are outstanding. Okay, remember authorized, issued, and outstanding? So it's always based on the amount of shares that is outstanding. That's not here. You don't see that here, but make sure you understand that the stock is issued on the dividends are issued on the shares that are outstanding, which goes back to the point of a balance sheet. If you see it has common stock, if you see it has treasury stock, make sure you reduce that amount of common stock by whatever the treasury stock is, because the cash dividend or the dividend is only based on the shares outstanding, authorized, issued, and outstanding. Okay. Any questions? What about preferred shares? Okay. When we have dividends on preferred shares, we have two different types of preferred shares: cumulative or non-cumulative. What's the difference between cumulative and non-cumulative shares? Preferred stock. Basically, here's the benefit. If it's a cumulative preferred share stock, then that means that, let's say it's my company this time, okay, and you have preferred stock. If I don't issue a dividend this year, but I issue one next year, then you are entitled to receive the dividend from this year and next year before I pay it to the common shareholder. Okay, so you have preference in dividends. That's what preferred stock. You have preference in dividends. So what does that mean? One more time. It's my company. I sell you a share, right? If I don't do dividends this year, then what happens? Then I must pay you dividends from this year and next year before I pay dividends to my common share stockholders. Okay? Which means that if I don't have enough to pay you dividends next year, then I have to finish paying you before I ever pay common stockholders. Remember, common stockholders have a right to vote. Your advantage is that you have dividends. You're always going to get your dividends if you have cumulative preferred stock. Cumulative preferred stock. Okay.
How do you receive preferred stock?
Man, you ask some perfect questions. This is how you do it. You see preferred stock 8% right here. It's always going to be 8% of the par value balance. Okay? So in this case, common stock, they would have put par value or something like that. When you get to the preferred stock, 8%. 8% of the par balance. Right here you have $6 million. That has a par value out there, right? So 8% of the $6 million is $480 million. So we know that when dividends are issued, in this example here, the year here is 2017, okay? When it is issued, then that's the amount that's going to be recorded, okay? So for 2017, we see that we declared cash dividends of $360,000, right? But the preferred share stockholders are supposed to receive how much? $480. Did we have enough? No. So that means that we're going to give what we have, $360,000 to the cumulative preferred share stockholders. And what are we going to do with the rest of the $120,000? It's going to carry over next year. Because remember, the preferred must receive dividends before the common stock gets anything. So for the first year, we didn't have enough. It's easy. Common stock doesn't receive anything. Next year, the preferred stockholders are entitled to their $480,000, right? But we're only going to pay dividends of how much? $500,000. So 480 from last year plus 120 from this year is what? $600,000. We don't have $600,000. We only have $500,000, right? Which means that common stockholders are going to receive what? Nothing. Year 3 or 2019, now we're going to pay dividends of $700,000. So that means that we're going to owe what? The $480,000 for this year plus what we have not paid. That totaled $580,000. Yes, we had enough to pay them, which means that the common stockholders are now happy because anything over and above that, they're going to receive the remainder of that. So that's where the remainder comes from, the 120. Don't get that 120 confused with the 360 minus the 480. It just happened to be there. The difference is that the 120 comes from the fact that we now have enough to pay common stockholders, and they're going to see any and everything above that, as long as it's available. Okay. Any questions?
So a question from, you were talking about liquidating stuff.
Okay, liquidating dividend, that's right.
Or dividend, I'm sorry.
Mhm.
And it doesn't come out of retained earnings, so does it just come out of the permanent cash account?
In that case, it can come out. It can. It's not. It's a return of capital. Trying to think of a different way to say it. That's probably the best
They're
way to say
losing
it.
money, basically, is what you're saying.
Or let's say it differently. It's you, and you're just simply you actually receiving a portion of what you put into the business. So you're not really getting a dividend.
I'm talking about the actual company is losing money, though. If
Yeah.
if they're not taking it out of retained earnings, because.
Right, because it's not something that they've actually planned to. No, I say not planned. It's not something that's coming out of their stockholders' equity section. So yes, that would be a good statement. Okay.
So the liquidating name is actually towards the perspective of the stock owner. Right?
Yes,
Okay,
yes,
because
yes.
they're
Like
liquidating
I had to say, going out of business sale. You're not going out of business, but you are receiving a portion back of what you had. Okay. Okay. All right. Let's go to the property dividends. Same concept is going to apply. Okay. So you're still going to have your establishment of your liability and your actual dividend and all that kind of stuff that you're going to do on the beginning date. And on the date of declaration, the ex-dividend date, there's still not a journal entry, and you're actually going to distribute the property dividend later. But there's one additional step that must occur on the declaration date. What is that step? That step calls for you to remeasure the dividend or the property at fair value. Okay. So in addition to establishing your liability and everything, make sure that you remeasure the property at fair value. Once you remeasure that property at fair value, then you can do that, record the journal entry for that, which I'll tell you in a second, and then record the payable and everything. What is the journal entry? The journal entry is going to be whatever it is at fair value, you're going to mark it up to the fair value, which means that you can have a gain or loss. That's the key word, the key thing I need you to remember. You can have a gain or loss after you remeasure that at fair value. Do not forget that. Okay. So that's the only additional step with the property value, or property dividend, I should probably say. Property dividends, remeasure it, and then establish the liability. And remember, you can have a gain or loss in that portion. Don't forget that.
If you don't have a gain or loss, is there no journal entry?
Well, you still want to remeasure to make sure you just don't have a gain or loss. You kind of mark it up or down. If it's none, then I guess technically you wouldn't have to have a journal entry. But yeah, technically you would not have to have a journal entry because there would be no gain or loss to record. It would be the same thing as you paid for it. Perfect. Good question. Good question. If there's no gain or loss, no journal entry. Okay, that's the only reason you remeasure it. So good question.
They kind of have to give us the book value for us to be able to do that, right?
Yes. So you have to know. Yeah, you have to know what it is, and then if there's a difference, yeah, good point. They'll give you all of that. Okay. And if they don't give it to you, they'll just say this many shares at this. Which means they're still giving to you just a slight simple computation. Okay. Last section we have here is stock dividends and stock splits. Stock splits are pretty easy. Okay. The overall value does not change. The overall value of a stock split of your value that you have does not change. Okay. If you remember, Apple did I think a 7-for-1 stock split. So if you had one share of stock was $700. Okay. After the stock split, it was worth about $100. Your value was still $100, right? You just had more stocks. So now, many reasons for doing it. One reason, of course, is affordability. I'm not, let's say you want to buy a share of stock. Do you just have an extra share? A couple of years ago, would you have just happen to have $700 laying around to buy a share of Apple stock? No. Okay. So with the 7-for-1 stock split, that means you could have bought one. Okay. Let's say it's sold for $100 and it's worth $150 now, right? At least you have made a $50 profit. Whereas if you didn't have the $700, you would have made no profit. So you kind of see they're not doing it for your benefit. But what I'm saying is, they actually give you the ability to buy more so that more people can invest in your company. Because if you can't buy it, at least remember now, we sell ownership to raise capital. So if I can't get you to buy $700, if I can't get you to give me $700, maybe I can get you to give me $100. Okay, and I need the 100 to be able to do some type of operations that I want to do. But if I'm still selling for 700, then I'm not cheating myself, but I'm just robbing myself of the opportunity to make money off certain things. Okay. Now there's a thing called a reverse stock split. Sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. We're not going to be testing on that. Just be aware that's out there, where it actually drives back up the price of the stock. And companies sometimes do that because they want to make it more attractive in terms of sometimes money market funds, things that are stocks kind of I've seen under $5. That's when you have a reverse stock split. Don't worry about that for this exam or for this class. Just be aware that they are out there. Okay. Now, with stock dividends, the line of demarcation, the most important thing you need to remember is 25%. If the stock issue is a stock dividend below 25%, you record it at fair value. If it's above, then you record it at par value. Okay, how does that look here? Look at the stock dividend here, where it's a small paragraph. See, under the second paragraph, Kraft declares and distributes a 10% stock dividend. You see that there? 10% stock dividend for Kraft.
I'm so sorry. Can you repeat that? If it's below 25%?
If it's below 25%, you issue it at fair value. And that's kind of the example we're going to look at right now. It's right below the property dividends example. Kraft declares and distributes 10% stock dividend. You see that there? Okay. What you have is 10% stock dividend. Now, one thing I need to remember, 10% is going to be what you issue in addition to. So if you have, let's just use an easy number, 100 shares of stock already there, and I issue 10% stock dividend, how many additional shares would I issue? 10. Okay, and your journal entry would be based on 10 times whatever that value is. So here you have a 10% stock dividend of 10 million shares. When the market value is 1 for the common stock and they're selling for $12 per share. So how much do I remove out of my retained earnings? The fair value or the market value of what they're selling for, $12 per share, right? Does that make sense? 10 million times $12 per share will give you the 120. That's how much I remove from my retained earnings. How much do I issue my stock for? Always at par. Always at par. Of course, if it was no par, it'd be a different story, but it's always at par. Your examples would be par values in this case right here. I can tell you that, okay? And the remainder goes to paid in capital. And what you see here that I really want you to understand is that you are removing a portion of the fair value. Excuse me, you are removing a portion of your retained earnings, okay? And you only just another way of looking at it, you can say that you are reclassifying your stock according to your retained earnings. It's no longer retained earnings, but it is in your paid in capital. And as you see, stockholders' equity is not reduced for that matter. Does that make sense? How do we increase stockholders' equity? Through a credit, right? We increase stockholders' equity through a credit. By us issuing common stock, that pretty much nullifies stockholders' equity being decreased by the stock dividend. Whereas if you look back at the cash dividend, what do you see? You debit retained earnings, but you do not credit a stock account, correct? So that means that stock dividends do not reduce retained earnings. Don't forget that. Okay. And of course, the stock dividend, the large stock dividend, if you flip over to use an example here, pretty good example that kind of lines up with what you were talking about earlier on stock splits effected in the form of stock dividends. Kind of really similar to what you had here. Kraft declares a 2-for-1 stock split effected in the form of a 100% stock dividend. Basically, that's saying that if they had 100 shares, they issue an additional 100 shares, okay? And you're going to record that at the par value, which means that common stock always is at par value, but the paid in capital in excess of par will be debited at par value. So the difference between the small and the large is that large stock dividends or the stock split effect in the form of stock dividend is recorded at par value. The small stock dividend is recorded at fair value. Okay? And everything else flows as it would. Any questions?